Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio and you're watching a special edition of Primetime Politics as we remember former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Joining us right now are Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, political journalist and frequent CPAC contributor Julie Van Dusen, and Joël-Denis Bellavance, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse. Hello to the three of you.
Hi there.
Thanks for having us on.
You know, a lot to talk about as we reflect back on the life and the career of Brian Mulroney, but I want to begin with, you know, that magic touch that he had. And certainly I think we saw that early on in his career and then certainly in his private life, because many people aspire to actually sit in the Prime Minister's office. But here you have a man who did so, but everyone's commenting about this magic touch that he had, Bob.
Yeah, he actually was a very, very charming man, both personally, but also as a campaigner. Julie and I particularly covered him, and this guy was amazing. He would, when he got in front of an audience, and by the way, in those days, there was no, anybody could show up at rallies when he actually played to that. Mm-hmm. But he'd crack jokes at the beginning, and then by the end of it, he was wound up and the whole crowd was going with him. And then when people started to heckle him, he played off the hecklers. It was just amazing to watch this guy operate. And so as a political campaigner, I've not seen anybody as effective as Brian Mulroney as an ability to campaign and get people motivated and interested and, cheering for him. But on a personal level, this was a man who was just enormously charming. I had a bad relationship with him as when I was a reporter. He didn't like a lot of the stories that I did. He called me an effing kneecapper. So that kind of gives you an idea of what he thought of me. But after he left office, we kind of made up. And my wife, mother had died. And I heard there was a phone call late in the evening, and I heard her talking on the phone, and she came out of the room she was in. She said, "That was Brian Mulroney who called to wish me condolences on my mother's death. I can't believe you were so mean to him."
To the magic touch.
So you can see how it works, right? You can see how it works.
Well, what are you talking? Like you two covered Brian Mulroney. You know the stories around it. When you think about that person's person that he was,
right.
What do you think of?
Well, I covered the tail end of him, and as Bob remembers, half of my relatives were working for him. So I always kept a bit of a
There's many Van Dusen, but anyway.
Many Van Dusen, plural. My dad was his caucus Leon. My sister had worked for him. My brother worked for Mazankowski. So thank God I was at the tail end of it, because if I started yelling at him the way I did to most politicians, my father would have probably given me hell. But anyway, so it didn't work that way. But when I think of him, I think of a lot of different things, just about the fact that he came from Baie-Comeau, from a large family, squished into that tiny house. He talks about it a lot, his dad being an electrician and so on, and his mother had boarders on the other side. So he said we were stacked up like cordwood. And because Baie-Comeau was so isolated, he used to love to listen to the radio and listen to what was going on in the States. And he passed a flyer around when he was a kid to make money, and he said at one point, "I can't believe they're paying me to talk to my neighbors. This is amazing," to go around and give flyers out and stuff like that. But on Bob's point about his personal appeal, I remember Lucien Bouchard just did an interview yesterday, and he said, "Il était fait pour la politique." He was made for politics. This guy, he oozed it. And he loved people, and that came from his small town roots. The fact that he never forgot who he was, and when you're talking about your wife, the fact that he called her to about her mother dying and so on. When I left CBC, I was writing a book on my mom. And I'm not trying to peddle it, it's not for sale. But anyway, and he heard about that. And Brian Mulroney, my mother's an artist, and he has 12 of her paintings. And he loves my mother, and he loves her work. So he phoned me up, and he wanted to be part of the book. He wanted to talk about my mother, how wonderful she was, that whole, she painted his 4 kids, and she had to skulk around 24/6. It was a surprise painting, and she had to wait till he left and then come out of the bushes with her easel and all that stuff. So he wanted to go over all that, and he wanted to talk about my mom and my dad, but he took it upon himself to do that, because he had some kind things to say, and he wanted to make sure that they were in the book.
Lovely thought. And Joël-Denis?
We talk about Diana as the Queen's people. I would say that Mr. Mulroney was the king of the people because he knew how to reach out to people. Bob mentioned the phone call that his wife received. That's a number of stories like that. I've heard that so many times. He had human qualities that allow him to reach out over even political partisanship and reach out to people who didn't agree with him, but they were going through tough times. And so that's why he remained popular within his caucus, even though like his caucus was a low of 10-15% in the polls, and they would still support him, no matter what. And that kind of politics that he did, Jean Charest took it with him when he went to Quebec and served as a premier and provincial leader of the Liberal Party and premier. And in fact, I was listening to Monsieur Jean Charest last night on TV, and he said he was like a second father to me. So that's how politics was. And then I think it's the end of an era. I don't think we're going to see politics that way. It's clearly at the end of the era, and that era chapter will be fully closed once Jean Chrétien, goes away.
Yeah, and I think we get a measure of that, right? Because in the immediate hours after his death was announced, you had many politicians of different stripes, the Prime Minister included, who thanked Mulroney for the type of mentorship he gave, and that is regardless of your political party, that type of nonpartisanship. Again, I don't know if that exists anymore. But as much as people are expressing their admiration for the many talents, I think we as journalists, we also have to note the fact that he had his many troubles as well. I'm thinking about the Oliphant Commission, the name of Karl-Heinz Schreiber. How does that affect the legacy that Brian Mulroney leaves behind, do you think?
Well, look, we're all flawed human beings. And he is clearly flawed, too. I mean, Mr. Mulroney was a great BSer. You had to cut and divide in two sometimes the stuff he had to say to you. And he clearly made a very serious error in accepting money from Karl-Heinz Schreiber. But at the same time, in the 20th century, there's only been two truly transformative prime ministers. One is Pierre Elliott Trudeau with the Charter of Human Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and Brian Mulroney for a free trade agreement with the United States and the GST. He has created millions of jobs and lifted people out of poverty and improved the lives of this country, making us a very competitive country. He believed in the power of the free enterprise. He privatized Petro-Canada and Air Canada, for example. He had an enormous legacy for this country. And it's not just that. One of his greatest achievements internationally was his fight for apartheid. I covered him during that period of time, and despite all of my problems that we had together as a hard-hitting reporter, these were one of our proudest moments as a Canadian, to see him stand up to Margaret Thatcher and to have these black leaders from Africa so admiring Mulroney for being the only Western leader. Ronald Reagan was against it, Margaret Thatcher was against him, and he stood up and fought. And when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first place he came was to Canada. Why? He said, because Brian Mulroney stood up for me while I was in prison, and he stood up for the black South Africans to rid that country of apartheid.
Absolutely, and I think that's very universally noted, how he was fighting for sanctions, even though clear, strong, and close allies were against it. However, do you think things like the Schreiber affair affect his legacy, Julie?
Well, I think it was very damaging to him. There was a committee inquiry on the Hill. I remember going to some of the hearings, and he was there with his wife. I'm trying to remember if he was there with his kids. His wife, yes, for sure.
Caroline was there.
Right, and he was clearly very uncomfortable, demoralized, because within all those hearings, if I recall, it did come to play that he had accepted some cash from Karl-Heinz Schreiber, which was in a safe in his basement or something, $200,000 and some, and it was never 100% clear how did it get there, what was it for, whatever.
Cash envelopes.
Right. Yeah, so, I mean, what's that about, right? So if I recall, I think after that point, I think he hired somebody, I think it was Robin Sears or whatever, as a spokesperson to...
For NDP.
Yes, and I think basically he spent a lot of time, a lot of years rehabilitating himself, and I'm trying to remember how. I mean, he gave talks, he gave speeches. I think the years just went by. He got an award for being the greenest prime minister. I think just after a while, people started saying, okay, that was not a good plan.
Well, I've talked to him about that, and I've said to him, you know, Mr. Mulroney, that's never going to, you can't whitewash this.
Right.
You accepted this. And it's going to be in the history books, but it's not going to be the big issue in the history books. It's your great accomplishments that historians are going to look at.
Yeah. Right. And he was very much concerned about his legacy. He talked about it quite often. But
if I may say, in Quebec, I've watched, you know, the coverage of Mr. Mulroney's passing away, and it's barely mentioned because in Quebec he's
the Karl-Heinz Schreiber.
He's seen as somebody who tried to reconcile Quebec with the rest of the country, not once but twice. He understood Quebec, and he brought Quebec nationalists into the fold. Yes, there was a rupture, but it turned out that Lucien Bouchard, the minister who left and founded the Bloc Québécois, reconciled with Mr. Mulroney over the last 8 months. So they were celebrating their friendship again until he passed away. And Mr. Bouchard was talking about this last night openly on the networks in French, and it was a very touching moment to see Lucien Bouchard recognizing that Mr. Mulroney was, he called him a big monument in Quebec.
Well, you know, I want to talk about that because, you know, he did pursue these big ideas, and certainly in this country, one of the hardest obstacles is to finally get Quebec's signature on the Constitution, and that certainly is what Brian Mulroney has tried to do with Meech Lake. How did Mulroney change the dialogue around the Constitution in Quebec, and what type of legacy does that leave behind?
There are some wounds still, I think, but we're slowly turning the page in Quebec, and I think that's a good thing. And because after the failure of Meech Lake, most of the things that were included in Meech Lake got, you know, brought up by the Chrétien government. The Distinct Society clause was adopted, and most of what was in
immigration stuff.
Exactly, the fact that Quebec is now consulted for the nomination in the Supreme Court, so most of it is done. And we've seen a more, I would say, constitutional peace as a result of it, because as time passed away, I think, but his legacy will remain as a prime minister who tried to reconcile Quebec and the rest of the country, and that's a huge legacy. Everybody was celebrating that yesterday.
I know Bob, you talked to him quite a bit, so I talked to him in late November because I'm kind of noodling away on a book on scrums and asking him about his relationship when he was prime minister with reporters and so on. But one of the things that was a kind of a sidebar, but he wanted to set the record straight on a lot of things. You know how he'll answer a question, then he'll say, and by the way, and he was talking about Meech Lake and the failure of it, and then lo and behold, he says, yeah, fine, I was a conservative prime minister, and Pierre Trudeau was against Meech Lake, but then sure enough in 1995 when the referendum happened and it looks like it's going to be lost, it was fine for Jean Chrétien to go give a speech in, I think it was Verdun, Quebec, talking about distinct society, we're going to do that for you. So he was he sounded a little bit bitter about that, you know, that he went through hell trying to get Meech Lake through, and it never passed. He lost friendships with Lucien Bouchard, the Bloc Québécois was formed, and then just a few years later, then it's the words at least are spoken by Jean Chrétien, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, quickly running out of time, so I'm going to fast forward to final thoughts here, and I'll go around the table because, as we noted, Mr. Mulroney had a love, not love so much, the media moments. Wondering, beyond what you already shared, Bob, any story that you want to share with people now?
Well, you know, he was obsessed with the media. He claimed that he never read news reports or watched TV, which wasn't true. One of his press secretaries, Michel Gratton, wrote a book, So What Are the Boys Saying? He wanted to know what we were doing. He read everything, and you knew when you wrote something bad, he wouldn't look at you. You know, he'd walk back. but if he liked the story, hello, Michael, how are you?
Oh, I love it. Julie?
Well, you know, I just think that as the years go on, when he was looking back, and I'm sorry, but this is like a 10-second thing, because I was asking him about his relationship with the media, and he was always criticized for his Gucci shoes and being too slick and all this stuff, and the media had a real thing on with him where a lot of times they did not get along. And I asked him about that, and he said, if you're going to be prime minister, you've got to have two things, a sense of humor and a sense of history. I had a feeling, given that what we had done on Meech Lake Accord, free trade, NAFTA, Nelson Mandela, the Acid Rain Treaty, growing the relationship with Washington, these were big ticket items. I had the sense that while we weren't going to get any credit then, history would look after us. So he kind of always had his eye on, okay, I'm not going to get these are not my friends. They are not my friends. I thought they were my friends, they're not. But as history goes forward, maybe looking back, people will see what I accomplished.
Well, and without a doubt, in the last 24 hours since this news has been known, those are exactly what people are commenting on, remembering of Brian Mulroney.
Quick personal story on my part. I was a page in the House of Commons, so I brought a glass of water to Mr. Mulroney and some messages from cabinet ministers to him. And when I was a page, I was studying at Carleton. You wanted to be a journalist, wanted to cover hockey, Montreal Canadiens. But after watching what Mr. Mulroney had done and the transformative leader that he was, I said, I'm going to cover another sports, politics. So I could tell Mr. Mulroney with the way what he brought, because when I was a page, Ronald Reagan came and gave a speech in the House of Commons, followed by François Mitterrand. Meech Lake was signed. There was a vote on capital punishment on a motion that was rejected to revive or reestablish capital punishment. Those were big moments in history for a kid of 18-year-old to watch. And I said, if I can watch it like this, I'd like to write about it one day. So I decided I wanted to be on the Hill, and I've been on the Hill since 1994.
Way better than a hockey game.
A great story. Yeah, and, the Sens are better anyways. So. Bob, Julie, Joël-Denis, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Nice being here.
Thank you.